Welcome back to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we step quietly beside Miss Marple as a lone key turns in an empty room, an impossible moment that whispers of secrets long concealed. Where in the world are you listening from? If this mystery stirs your curiosity, join us for more tales. Now, pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. St. Mary Mead, on a winter afternoon softened by pale sun, held its usual equilibrium. The quiet scrape of hedgerows being trimmed, the distant clatter of teacups in cottage kitchens, and the faint hum of the vicarage bell testing its tone for evening prayers. It was the kind of gentle rhythm the village trusted, the sort that made days feel neatly stitched together. Yet even in this calm, the air held a charged stillness like the quiet moment before a curtain stirs, hinting that something unseen is about to shift. Miss Marple, seated by her parlor window with her knitting resting lightly in her lap, sensed that subtle change as one might feel the shift of weather in their bones. She watched the lane outside as a single figure hurried past young Lily Prendergast from the manor's domestic staff, her cap askew and her coat unbuttoned, glancing back not once but twice as though she feared her own shadow might speak. Moments later came the sound of voices along the lane, not loud enough to constitute a commotion, but threaded with urgency. Mrs. Hartnell, red-cheeked and brimming with unhelpful self-importance, was whispering quite audibly to Mrs. Price. Ridley. And locked, yes, locked from the inside, but no one inside at all. A room cannot simply empty itself, Mary. Doors do not lock themselves. Mrs. Price Ridley responded with a brisk tut that implied the entire affair was not only suspicious, but, more importantly, poorly managed. Miss Marple set down her knitting. A locked door, an empty room. A key turned when no one was meant to be there. It was not yet gossip, merely a rumor on the brink of becoming one, but she knew such things rarely traveled without reason. Soon enough, the village's equilibrium shifted a fraction further. Mr. Clement, the vicar, appeared at her gate, breathing slightly short and expression grave. The kind of gravity reserved for matters that might soon become public concern. "Miss Marple," he began, opening the gate with a hand that trembled just subtly enough to betray his inner disturbance. "Might I trouble you for a moment? Something has occurred at the manor. Something rather unfortunate." He did not need to elaborate. Miss Marple rose at once, her coat already draped on the chair behind her as though she had anticipated the moment. "Of course, dear," she replied gently. "Is it Mrs. Bantry again? Or has Colonel Melrose lost one of his garden tools in a regrettable manner?" The vicar managed a thin, strained smile, one that fell quickly. "No, nothing of that kind." "Well, there's been an incident in the East Wing sitting room. It seems someone has been found." The word "found" required no gramophone to echo. Miss Marple heard its meaning clearly, not asleep, not fainting, but found in the permanent sense. The walk toward the manor carried with it a curious tremor through the air, as though each cottage they passed leaned in to listen. A sparrow startled from a hedge as they approached, the sudden fluttering sounding almost like a gasp. Miss Marple's eyes moved over familiar landmarks, the lane sloping gently toward the manor gates, the moss-slick stone wall, the holly branches glistening with frost, but her mind was already working, quietly cataloguing the small peculiarities of the moment. There was Lily Prendergast again, near the side gate, twisting her apron in nervous loops. She bowed her head when Miss Marple glanced her way, but not before the old woman noted the girl's trembling hands and reddened eyes. The vicar hesitated as though he wished to speak to Lily, but thought better of it instead. He motioned Miss Marple toward the front entrance. Inside the manor, warmth from the hearth did little to soften the tension that had settled over the staff clustered in the hallway. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dowsett, stood stiff as an ironing board, her lips pressed in a line of dignity strained almost beyond endurance. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful," she murmured, wringing her hands, though she pretended not to. Mr. Lawrence said the door was locked, from the inside. But when they broke it open, well, her voice trailed off into a shudder rather than a sentence. Colonel Melrose emerged from the East Wing corridor, his usually composed manner weighted with concern. Miss Marple, just the person. He looked relieved in a way that might have offended a lesser soul. Miss Marple merely nodded. It's a troubling situation. No sign of forced entry. No indication anyone left the room. But the key was turned firmly. And Andrews, well, Andrews is dead. Andrews, the manor's quiet clerk, who handled the household accounts and wrote with such neat, pale ink that his ledgers looked printed rather than penned. Miss Marple felt a faint tightening in her chest, not shock, but a sorrowful recognition that even the least assuming lives could end in violent puzzlement. Colonel Melrose led her toward the room. The corridor felt cooler than the rest of the house, the air oddly stale. "We've not moved anything," he explained in a low voice, except to confirm he was beyond help. At the door, splintered where it had been forced, a constable stood guard. The room inside was small and elegantly kept, though a sense of disarray hung about it not from struggle but from abandonment, as though its occupant had been interrupted mid-thought. Andrews lay beside the writing desk, his spectacles still perched on his nose. A tray of tea had cooled at his elbow. One of the curtains had been drawn slightly askew, and a faint draught slipped through the window frame, but Miss Marple's eyes moved elsewhere to the key still in the lock, angled oddly toward the floor, to the half-written sheet of paper on the desk, and to a single fallen glove near the hearth rug. Its leather scuffed in a way inconsistent with Andrew's careful manner. She did not comment, not yet. Her gaze swept once more, steady and unhurried. Every detail held its breath, waiting to be understood. Behind her, Colonel Melrose cleared his throat. "We'll need to inform the inspector, but I wanted your advice first, considering the circumstances." Miss Marple touched the back of a chair lightly, the gesture gentle, reflective. "A locked room," she murmured, almost to herself, "and a key that turned while the room was empty. People do such interesting things under pressure, Colonel, even the quiet ones." The village, she knew, would be murmuring by supper time. But beneath the gossip, beneath the respectable shock, a pattern was already forming, faint as a thread of smoke. But there, a soft tap sounded at the doorway. Lily Prendergast stood there, pale as milk. "Colonel, there's something you ought to know," she whispered. Her eyes flicked once to Miss Marple, full of fear and something else, guilt or perhaps recognition. Lily hesitated at the threshold, as though an invisible line separated her from the room, from its stillness, and from what her words might disturb. Colonel Melrose beckoned her gently forward, but it was Miss Marple who offered the smallest nod of encouragement, a steadying warmth amidst the manor's chill. With careful steps, Lily entered, her gaze fixed not on Andrew's body, but on the floorboards just beside it, as though afraid to acknowledge what lay inches away. "I didn't know if I should say anything," she murmured. "But I heard something earlier, before they found him." The colonel straightened. "What kind of something?" His voice, though softened for her sake, carried the weight of authority that made the girl swallow hard. Lily wrung her hands. A sound in this room, not loud, more like the scrape of a chair, but when I came to collect the tea tray later, the door was locked. I thought perhaps Mr. Andrews didn't want to be disturbed, so I left it just outside. Her eyes drifted toward the overturned tray inside, cold cups untouched, but he never did forget his tea. Miss Marple watched her closely, not the words, but the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor of her right hand, the way she avoided looking at the desk. Guilt? Fear? Or merely the shock of finding herself at the center of a village storm? In St. Mary Mead, one rarely knew at first glance. Respectability, Miss Marple knew, could be as deceptive as a freshly polished mirror. The colonel asked, "Did you see anyone in the corridor?" Anyone near the east wing at all?" Lily shook her head. "Only Mr. Lawrence earlier. He said he was looking for a set of keys. He always keeps spares for the guest rooms, but he seemed flustered more than usual." She paused as though unsure if she should continue. "He told me to forget I'd seen him." Miss Marple tucked that away mentally, a curious detail, yet not necessarily meaningful. People often wished small embarrassments were forgotten, especially those who prided themselves on being indispensable. Colonel Melrose exchanged a glance with the vicar before turning toward the corridor. "We'll speak with Lawrence. Miss Marple, would you mind staying with Lily for a moment?" "She seems rather shaken." "I should be glad to," Miss Marple replied. As the men stepped out, the room's hush thickened. Lily's breath came quicker, her composure cracking at last now that authority had gone. Miss Marple guided her toward a chair, her tone soft. "My dear, you've been through more than you realize. Fear can make the mind jump to dreadful conclusions. Are you certain there was nothing else? Nothing small or odd?" Lily hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was something on the writing desk earlier today. A key on a ribbon. It wasn't there when Mr. Andrews called me in to fetch the afternoon letters. He told me not to touch it." Her voice dropped further. "When I looked just now, it's gone." Miss Marple glanced toward the tidy desk where a square of dust was faintly disturbed, as if something small and frequently handled had once rested there. A key removed. A key inserted in the wrong lock or exchanged. People so often placed things where they should not, convinced no one would notice. Before she could inquire further, the constable at the door shifted uneasily. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, addressing Miss Marple, though his eyes flicked toward Lily. "But the inspector just arrived and wanted everyone in the hall. We're to keep the room closed." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt as she offered Lily her arm. "Come, dear. Best not to leave your thoughts too long alone." In the hall, the inspector, a tall, stony-faced man named Inspector Grayson, was already issuing brisk instructions. Staff were to remain on the premises. No one was to discuss the incident outside the house, and all keys belonging to the manor guest rooms, storage cupboards, and administrative offices were to be accounted for. Mr. Lawrence, the butler, stood rigid beside the staircase, his complexion pallid. "Inspector," he said tightly, "I assure you nothing is amiss with the keys. I keep them all under lock, and then we shall verify that," Grayson interrupted, his tone dry. "A locked room death demands precision." Miss Marple observed Lawrence's reaction with quiet interest. Not alarm, precisely more a deep offended pride, the kind that emerges when one's sense of control is threatened. Appearances, she reflected, could crack in such moments, revealing what lay beneath. The inspector turned to address the household collectively. "Until we understand how a man died in a room that appeared inaccessible, no detail is too small." His gaze landed briefly on Lily before moving on. "Anyone who heard or saw anything unusual must speak up." A faint tremor crossed the girl's face, betraying a second thought she dared not voice. Miss Marple caught it instantly, filing it away as she would a dropped stitch, small but potentially vital. The inspector began lining people up for questioning, and a hush fell over the group. Miss Marple glanced back toward the closed door of the sitting room, noticing something she had missed earlier, the thin draught slipping from beneath it, carrying with it the faint scent of ashes and something metallic, a whisper of a clue, easily overlooked. She moved toward the wall to steady herself, her fingers brushing the cool paneling. And there, almost by accident, she noticed a hairline crack near the skirting board, a mark too deliberate to be aged alone. Something had pressed hard against that wall. Something or someone. Miss Marple kept her fingers lightly on the paneling, the faint irregularity beneath the paint lingering in her thoughts. A mark like that did not appear without cause, yet it would have been invisible to nearly everyone in the hallway. overshadowed as they were by the inspector's stern presence. She allowed her hand to fall naturally to her side before turning toward the assembled staff, her expression mild, almost distracted. No one needed to know she had noticed anything at all. Inspector Grayson was already questioning Mr. Lawrence with tidy efficiency. "You maintain a strict system with the manor keys, do you?" he asked, his tone clipped, his pencil poised. "And yet we hear from multiple staff that you are searching for a missing set." Lawrence's nostrils flared. "Not missing. Misplaced for a moment. I found them shortly after. It was hardly a matter worth broadcasting." His gaze slid across Lily with a cold resentment that suggested he had guessed where the inspector had heard the rumor. Nevertheless, Grayson replied, "A misplaced key becomes very interesting when a man dies behind a locked door." Mrs. Dowsett bristled beside the coat stand. "Inspector, Mr. Lawrence has managed this house for 12 years with utmost care. If he says the keys were accounted for, they were." The inspector made a note with slow deliberation. "Respectability does not remove one from suspicion, Mrs. Dowsett. It only makes the motive less visible." His eyes flicked briefly toward Miss Marple, perhaps in acknowledgement of her reputation, though he said nothing more. The vicar stood nearby, offering a steady if worried presence. "Inspector, might it not be better to speak with Miss Marple? She has a certain sensitivity to people's." Grayson cut him off with a small, polite bow. "I'm aware of Miss Marple's aptitude. I should value her observations once the initial statements are taken." He said it with professional courtesy, though the faint tension around his mouth suggested a man protective of his authority. Miss Marple pretended not to notice. She drifted toward Lily, whose hands remained clasped tight, as though she feared they might betray her if allowed movement. "You mentioned that key on the ribbon," Miss Marple said softly. "Was it unusual? Perhaps an old one? The manor has many curiosities." Lily swallowed. It was polished, new-looking, not like those heavy brass ones for the guest rooms. "I thought it strange Mr. Andrews had it at all." Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic, her eyes sharpening for a fraction of a second. A new, clean, purposeful key stood apart from the symbolic weight of the household's older locks, a contrast between appearance and history. People sometimes hide truth behind the newest and brightest objects. Before she could consider it further, a sudden burst of footsteps sounded from the stairwell. Mr. Lawrence's junior assistant, young Peter Crowthorne, rushed down with cheeks flaming and breath uneven. "Inspector, sir, there's something you ought to see in Mr. Andrews's ledger room." A shift ran through the gathered staff like a ripple of wind across tall grass. Grayson gestured sharply. "Show me." Miss Marple, with the unobtrusive persistence of age, followed at a gentle distance. The ledger room, adjacent to Andrews's small office, smelled faintly of ink and coal dust. Peter hovered at the doorway. "I didn't mean to pry, sir. Only Andrews would never leave drawers open. And now 2 of them are." Indeed, 2 narrow drawers hung askew from the cabinet, one empty, one containing a few loose papers. A single sheet lay atop the desk, half crumpled. Grayson snapped it up, a list of expenditures and something scratched out, his brow furrowed, deliberately erased. Lawrence stiffened. "Those ledgers are confidential. If someone tampered with them, someone did," the inspector replied calmly. "Perhaps Mr. Andrews discovered it." Miss Marple drifted closer. The faint smell of graphite clung to the paper someone had rubbed out the line recently. She traced the edge of the desk with her eyes, noting a small indentation near the inkpot, as if something had been pressed hard against the wood. Another mark of pressure, another sign of tension beneath the house's polished surface. Peter spoke up again, voice trembling. "So the household accounts have been unusual this month. Mr. Andrews asked me twice if I had moved files I hadn't touched." Lawrence wheeled round on him. "You should watch your tongue. You know nothing of how this house is run." "But Peter, emboldened by fear or righteousness, did not retreat. Someone was in this room last night. I'm sure of it. The lamp was warm this morning, though Andrews hadn't been in yet. Inspector Grayson narrowed his eyes. Is that so? And you told no one? I didn't want to get anyone in trouble, sir. Miss Marple studied Peter's expression earnestly, frightened, but with a stubborn glint that reminded her of a young man determined to be believed. He could be lying, of course, but sincerity was not always a guarantee of truth. People lied most convincingly when they believed themselves honest. Grayson tapped the erased line. Something connected to money, perhaps. A reason someone would not wish to be discovered. Lawrence's jaw tightened. Mrs. Dowsett fidgeted. Even the constable at the door shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple, however, let her gaze settle on the window. Frost had begun to gather along its lower edge, thinning into a small streak where warmth from a passing hand had melted it. An accidental mark or a sign someone had peered in from the corridor, watching. The inspector noticed her looking and approached. Miss Marple, you see something? She offered a mild smile. Only that houses often keep secrets better than people expect. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes held a glimmer of quiet certainty. The inspector seemed unsatisfied, yet he paused as a thought stirred behind his gaze. Before he could speak, a distant bell rang from the main hall and the manor's front door. Someone arriving at such a moment could only mean news, welcome or otherwise. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the sound, sensing the shift in the household's breath. The bell's echo lingered through the corridor, its tone too sharp to belong to anything so ordinary as a delivery. Inspector Grayson strode toward the entrance with purposeful steps, the staff instinctively parting to allow him through. Miss Marple followed at a gentler pace, her interest piqued by the muted tension shifting through the household like a draft through old beams. At the open door stood a man wrapped in a dark overcoat, his expression guarded beneath the brim of his hat. The inspector addressed him briskly. "Can I help you?" The visitor offered a polite nod. "I'm Mr. Edward Holdrew. I corresponded with Mr. Andrews regarding an audit. He was expecting me today to discuss certain discrepancies." He paused, noticing the anxious faces beyond the inspector. "I assume something has happened." Grayson motioned him inside. "Your timing is exceptionally relevant, Mr. Holdrew. Mr. Andrews is dead." The man's breath caught not dramatically, but with the subtle restraint of someone accustomed to controlling his reactions. "Dead? But I only meant to review figures with him, nothing more." His gaze slipped toward the east wing, thoughtful rather than sorrowful, as though recalculating a plan. Miss Marple observed him quietly. The crispness of his collar, the immaculate shine of his shoes, the faint scent of cold air clinging to his coat all suggested a man who valued appearances. Yet something about the stiffness of his hands, held too rigidly at his sides, hinted at tension beneath his polished exterior. The inspector led Holdrew toward the drawing room. "We'll need to speak with you in detail. How long were these discrepancies under discussion?" Holdrew hesitated. "Several weeks." Mr. Andrews had grown increasingly concerned. He believed someone was manipulating the household accounts. I agreed something was irregular, though we had not yet identified where. A murmur ran through the gathered staff. Mrs. Dowsett clutched her necklace, her composure wobbling. Mr. Lawrence's jaw hardened as though bracing for an accusation. Grayson's voice remained steady. "Did Mr. Andrews mention suspects?" "No." Holdrew's answer was swift but guarded. He only said he feared things were not as they appeared. Miss Marple's eyes warmed with recognition at the phrase. Truth cloaked in respectability, a theme familiar not only to auditors, but to village life itself. People so often wrapped secrets in neat packages, assuming no one would notice the seam. The inspector leaned forward. "You must remain here until we complete our inquiries." Before Holdrew could respond, a small commotion stirred near the staircase. Peter Crowthorne, flushed and breathless, emerged clutching something in his hand. "Inspector, excuse me, but this was in the waste bin in Andrews's office." He held out a small scrap of paper, folded once and then torn hastily. Grayson flattened it. The fragment contained only a single line in Andrew's neat script. "He knows about the key." A collective silence fell. Lily backed a step toward the wall, her breath catching audibly. Mr. Lawrence's eyes darted toward her before fixing sternly on the inspector. Grayson's expression grew more severe. "Which key?" he demanded of the room at large. "The household keys, the guest room keys, or something entirely different?" No one answered. Miss Marple glanced at the scrap, noting the firmness of the ink. Recently written perhaps minutes before Andrews died, or before he expected someone to silence him. Her gaze drifted toward the hall's coat stand, where a tasseled cord swayed faintly, disturbed by someone passing moments earlier. A small detail, too subtle for most, yet these small disturbances often held stories of their own. Peter shifted uneasily. "Sir, if Andrews wrote that today, then he must have been planning to speak to someone who frightened him." Grayson snapped, "And you're certain this came from his office?" "Yes, sir. Buried under other rubbish." Mrs. Dowsett let out a frail whisper. He was such a quiet man. Who would frighten him? Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she let her gaze move between the faces before her. Lily, pale and trembling, Lawrence, rigid with indignant composure, Dowsett, anxious and brittle Peter, earnest but fearful, and now Holdrew, observing the room with the cool calculation of a man accustomed to numbers, not murder. Any of them could be telling the truth. Any could be lying. Respectability often masked deeper fractures. Inspector Grayson folded the scrap and slipped it into his pocket. "We continue questioning. No one leaves." As he turned back toward the drawing room, Miss Marple remained where she stood, examining the faint trail of wetness on the floorboard's droplets from someone's coat or boots. They led not toward the front door, but toward the east wing where Andrews had died. A small thing, yet small things rarely lied. She followed the trail with her eyes until it vanished near the corner where the corridor bent toward the ledger room. Something or someone had moved quickly there, perhaps before the inspector arrived. Miss Marple's breath slowed as a quiet certainty began to form, delicate as frost tracing a window. A question emerged in her thoughts, not yet fully shaped, but persistent, and when she lifted her eyes toward the corridor, she saw someone watching her. A pair of eyes met Miss Marple's from the bend of the corridor, startled, then swiftly masked behind a veneer of calm. It was Mrs. Dowsett, the housekeeper, who stepped forward with a stiff smile that tried too hard for normalcy. "Miss Marple," she said, in a voice pitched slightly higher than usual, "I wondered if you might need a cup of tea. It's all quite dreadful, and people do get faint." The offer, though kindly spoken, carried the faint scent of evasion. Miss Marple inclined her head. "That would be kind, Mrs. Dowsett. But first, were you looking for someone just now?" Her tone was light, innocent, but her eyes observed everything, the slight flush rising in the woman's cheeks, the hands smoothing her apron for the third time in as many seconds. Oh no. I merely thought to check that the staff were calm." But the answer came too quickly, and her glance flickered toward the east wing door before she steadied it. Inspector Grayson called from the drawing room, summoning Mrs. Dowsett for questioning, and the housekeeper seized upon the interruption with palpable relief. "I mustn't keep him waiting," she murmured, slipping away as though escaping a draft. Miss Marple watched her go, the earlier unease lingering. A woman like Mrs. Dowsett knew every corridor, every stair tread, every whisper within the manor. Yet she had looked as though she'd hidden something behind her expression, as though respectability had become a garment she clutched too tightly. The inspector's voice carried down the hall, punctuated by the flipping of notebook pages. Mr. Holdrew had taken a seat by the fire, arms crossed, observing the household with the discomfort of a man forced prematurely into scandal. Lily lingered near the banister, breathing in shallow, anxious sips, while Peter Crowthorne paced near the ledger room, each pass marked by a nervous tug at his collar. The atmosphere tightened, and Miss Marple moved toward Lily with gentle purpose. "My dear," she said quietly, "you look as though you've been left out in the cold." Lily startled at the touch on her elbow. "I didn't want to say it out loud," she whispered. "But when Peter found that note, I thought it might mean me. The key I saw earlier, Mr. Andrews said not to touch it." Miss Marple softened her voice. "Fear can make shadows larger than they are. What mattered to Mr. Andrews may not be what you imagine." She let a small pause settle. "Tell me, did he seem frightened when he spoke to you, or simply determined?" Lily's brow furrowed as she considered. "Determined, I think. Focused, as if he'd realized something important. That fit what Miss Marple suspected. Andrews had been on the verge of revelation, not panic. And that suggested someone else, someone more desperate, had acted under pressure. A door clicked open behind them, and the inspector emerged with Mrs. Dowsett. Her face looked paler, her lips pressed together in a line so taut it seemed drawn with ink. She brushed past Lily without acknowledging her. Grayson signaled for Mr. Lawrence next. The butler advanced with shoulders stiff and chin lifted, a man affronted by implication. "This household relies on order," he declared before even entering the room. "I run it precisely." "Precisely," Miss Marple murmured, watching him disappear inside. She moved subtly toward the ledger room once more, her steps unhurried, as though simply seeking a quiet corner. The small trail of moisture she had noted earlier had begun to dry, but the faint outline remained leading to the cabinet Andrews had stored his most sensitive documents in. She studied the lock, a modern mechanism incompatible with the Manor's older skeleton keys. A new lock for a new problem, and perhaps a new key, one polished, one kept on a ribbon, one Andrews had guarded. She bent slightly, examining the area more closely. Near the baseboard, trapped in a sliver of shadow, was a small fleck of something metallic, a chip from a key, or simply flint from the coal bucket. She reached, but before her fingers brushed it, footsteps echoed behind her. Peter Crowthorne approached, flustered. "Miss Marple, I didn't mean to overhear you and Lily, but the key you mentioned I think I saw, not today. Last week, in Andrew's hand." He swallowed. He was arguing with Mr. Lawrence. Miss Marple straightened slowly. "Arguing? That seems unlike both of them." "It wasn't loud," Peter said, "but the tone Mr. Andrews said something about not hiding behind duties, and Mr. Lawrence told him he understood nothing of running a household. Then they both noticed me, and the conversation stopped. Respectability fraying, appearances cracking, and," Peter continued, voice dropping further, "I saw Mr. Lawrence with the same ribboned key later that day. Only for a moment he stuffed it into his pocket." Miss Marple regarded him with calm gravity. "And you told no one?" "I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want trouble." Such a phrase, she thought, had been responsible for more mischief in village life than malice ever achieved. Before she could speak again, Inspector Grayson's voice barked from the drawing room. "Miss Marple, may I have a word?" She turned toward the summons, but not before noting a new detail. Lily, standing near the staircase, staring at Peter with an expression she tried and failed to conceal, an expression not only of fear, but of recognition. Inspector Grayson waited near the drawing-room threshold, his expression composed but sharpened by the strain of too many unanswered questions. Miss Marple approached with quiet steps, noting how Lily's gaze still lingered on Peter, and how quickly the girl looked away when she realized she had been observed. Something passed between those two, a shared knowledge, or a shared fear that neither yet dared to voice. Miss Marple, Grayson began as she reached him, your presence would be useful for this next part. Holdrew insists he must clarify something privately. He lowered his voice. I don't trust men who withhold only the parts they choose to confess. Miss Marple nodded, following him inside. Mr. Holdrew stood by the mantelpiece, leaning heavily on one arm as though steadying himself against an internal tremor. The contrast between his polished appearance and the crack of uncertainty in his posture did not escape her. He looked up. Inspector, I didn't want to speak in front of the staff. Matters of finance are delicate. Most crimes are, Grayson said dryly. Out with it. Holdrew exhaled. Mr. Andrews discovered irregular withdrawals, small sums at first, then larger ones. They were cleverly masked beneath supply orders and maintenance fees. He traced them back a month, perhaps more. He hesitated. He believed someone in the house was siphoning funds. Grayson folded his arms. Did Andrews suspect who? No, Holdrew replied, though his eyes flicked toward the door as if someone might be listening. He said only that the pattern suggested knowledge of the household's inner systems. Someone trusted, someone who knew he seldom checked certain ledgers during winter. A hush pressed into the room. Miss Marple's gaze lowered to the hearth rug. Its tidy thread slightly disturbed a footstep, perhaps, or the weight of someone pacing earlier. Appearances always shifted under pressure. Rugs rumpled, voices cracked, and truths emerged where one least expected them. Holdrew continued. I encouraged him to confront the matter gently. He said he would speak with 2 people today, Mr. Lawrence and one other. His voice tightened, but he didn't say who. Grayson's eyes narrowed. Why did you not mention this when you arrived? Holdrew looked genuinely troubled. I feared it would cast suspicion unfairly. I didn't expect to find him dead. Miss Marple touched the edge of the mantelpiece with a light, thoughtful hand. Men deeply worried often speak obliquely, she said softly. Mr. Andrews was the kind to guard unpleasant truths until he was quite sure. Her gaze lifted, but he was close to being sure. That is what frightens people. Grayson turned sharply. You think the motive was money? She smiled faintly. Oh, motives are rarely so tidy. Money often hides something deeper, pride, fear, resentment, and appearances, well, they deceive in both directions. Before the inspector could respond, hurried footsteps approached. Peter entered, pale and anxious. Inspector, he said with a swallow, you asked for the inventory of keys. I've counted them again. One is missing. Grayson stiffened. Which? Peter held up the ring, the spare for the ledger room. The new lock was the one Mr. Andrews insisted on last month. A breeze of tension swept the drawing room. Holdrew straightened. Grayson muttered a sharp oath. Miss Marple let her gaze drift toward the high windows where faint winter light reflected on the glass like fractured strands of truth. Who last had access to that key? Grayson demanded. Peter hesitated. It would have been Mr. Lawrence. He oversees the secure drawers. That is not true, came a voice from the doorway. Mrs. Dowsett stepped inside, her composure brittle but her resolve stiffening like starch. I had that key yesterday. Mr. Lawrence asked me to fetch Andrews for a housekeeping matter. I opened the ledger room for him, then returned the key to its hook. Grayson turned on her. Why didn't you say so earlier? I forgot, she stammered, in all the chaos. But Miss Marple saw the flicker behind the woman's eyes. Not forgetfulness. Something else. A fear of being entangled. The inspector pressed on. And after yesterday, who handled it then? Before Dowsett could answer, Lily's voice rose from behind her, thin and trembling. I saw Mr. Lawrence take it. This morning. Before Andrews, she faltered. All eyes turned to her. Lawrence, who had been waiting just outside, stepped into view, his expression thunderous. This is preposterous. I took nothing. The girl is frightened and invents things. But Lily's breath came too quickly for invention. Her hands twisted in her apron. I saw you. You tucked something into your coat and told me to forget I'd seen you. The butler's jaw clenched, but his protest died unspoken. A long silence stretched across the room until the inspector broke it with a clipped, "Mr. Lawrence, come with me." He marched the butler away, leaving the household rippling with unease. Miss Marple remained still a moment longer, watching Lily and Peter exchange a fraught glance. There was truth there, but also something withheld, some shared awareness wrapped tight in fear. And as the door to the corridor closed behind the inspector and Lawrence, Miss Marple turned slightly, her attention caught by the faintest sound of a soft, deliberate step on the stairwell above. Someone else had been listening. The soft tread from the upper stairwell drew Miss Marple's attention just long enough for her to glimpse a figure retreating along the landing, swift, purposeful, and unmistakably avoiding notice. She did not pursue age and had taught her that those who wish to hide often revealed more by fleeing than by staying. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle, as dust settled after a passing carriage, while the rest of the household remained frozen in the drawing-room's uneasy air. Lily, trembling anew, edged closer to the banister, as though the house itself had grown too large around her. Peter stood nearby, hands clenched in guilty agitation. Their exchanged looks carried the weight of something unsaid, a secret stretched thin between them. Before Miss Marple could draw nearer, Inspector Grayson returned from the corridor, his expression taut. "Lawrence denies everything, of course," he said sharply. "Claims the girl is confused, that the key must have been taken by Andrews himself." His eyes flicked toward Lily, yet his coat pockets were suspiciously light. Miss Marple asked mildly, "Meaning something has been removed?" "Or never placed there at all," Grayson replied. "He insists he never touched the key. But if it is missing, someone must have had cause to remove it." Mr. Haldrew, still stationed near the mantelpiece, spoke with a measured tone. "Inspector, you're assuming theft. But it's also possible Andrews misplaced the key in his agitation. He was under considerable stress. Perhaps Grayson cut him off. I do not find it plausible that a man planning to confront a thief would misplace the very evidence required." Haldrew's jaw tightened, a sign of suppressed irritation rather than defensiveness. Miss Marple noted the shift of a man more accustomed to pointing out errors than being suspected of them. The inspector's gaze swept the room. "Until we understand who had access to that key, no one is exempt." A tense silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock, a small, steady reminder that time marched on regardless of hidden truths. Its rhythm echoed the story's motif, a surface of calm marking the seconds, masking the deeper, restless workings within. Miss Marple stepped closer to the window, letting the household noise fade behind her. Outside, the frost on the garden paths had thickened into a delicate sheen, reflecting the pale winter light in shimmering fragments. She watched it thoughtfully, for something about the pattern of disturbance earlier, the faint trail of moisture leading from the front entrance, troubled her. She turned back. "Inspector," she said gently, "has anyone checked the smaller back entrance? The one near the servants' stairs?" Grayson frowned. "What of it?" "Well," Miss Marple murmured, "in older houses, Leisures doors often hold secrets the main entrances do not. People forget them, you see, or imagine others have forgotten." The inspector's brow furrowed as though weighing whether her point was symbolic or literal. Before he could answer, a new voice floated down the stairs, thin, wavering, but clear. "I don't know what you're all suggesting, but I won't be blamed for it." Mrs. Dowsett descended the steps with a flurry of indignation, clutching something tightly to her chest, a folded cloth or perhaps an apron. Her face was blotched, her composure fractured. "Mr. Lawrence may be difficult, but he's no thief, and he certainly isn't a killer." Grayson crossed to her. "No one has been accused, but you're agitated, Mrs. Dowsett." "Why?" She stiffened. "The stress of the day. This household has run respectably under my care for years. I won't have its name tarnished." "Respectability," Miss Marple said softly, "is a fragile garment, my dear. Pull one thread incorrectly, and the whole thing unravels." Mrs. Dowsett winced as though struck, and Miss Marple wondered whether her metaphor had landed closer to truth than intended. The housekeeper clutched the cloth more tightly. "I must return to the laundry," she muttered. "The staff are frightened. Someone needs to maintain order." She hurried past them, the stairs creaking under her weight, and disappeared around the first-floor corner, the same corner from which Miss Marple had earlier glimpsed someone listening. A curious coincidence. As Dowsett vanished, Lily collapsed onto a nearby chair, her breath ragged. "Miss Marple, I can't bear this. I didn't mean to get anyone in trouble." Miss Marple rested a hand on her shoulder. "You did what conscience required. Truth rarely sits comfortably." Peter hovered nearby. He seemed torn between stepping forward and retreating altogether. At last he said, "Inspector, I didn't tell you everything earlier." "Heard Andrews arguing again last night." His eyes darted to the ledger room. "I thought it was with Lawrence, but now I'm not certain." Grayson turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Peter swallowed. The voice. It was softer, more controlled. "Lawrence blusters. This person didn't." Miss Marple observed him closely. "And you heard nothing else? Only the phrase, 'You don't know what you're risking.'" Andrews said it, frightened but determined. The inspector closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Then we will search every room in this house, beginning with the upper floor. Someone is hiding something, and I intend to find it." Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward toward the landing where the faint sound had come earlier. The quiet, listening figure, the shadow that retreated. She felt a small pull of certainty forming. Someone above was already anticipating the inspector's search, perhaps even preparing for it. And as she listened, the unmistakable click of a door latch echoed faintly overhead. Inspector Grayson lifted his head sharply at the faint click of the latch above, the sound carrying through the stillness with the clarity of a footstep in snow. "Upstairs," he ordered, striding toward the staircase. The constable followed close behind. Miss Marple ascended more slowly, her hand grazing the banister, noting the tremor in the wood as though the house itself resented the disturbance. The landing was dimmer than below, lit only by a narrow window where pale winter light cast fractured shapes across the carpet. Grayson glanced left, then right. "One of these rooms," he muttered. "Someone's hiding something up here." The corridor stretched ahead, doors on either side, each one closed, each holding its own quiet breath. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the faintest disturbance on the floor, a small scuff of moisture, as though a damp shoe had brushed the carpet before retreating. She followed the mark with a gentle pivot of her head until it vanished before the last door on the right. Grayson noticed her gaze. "This one?" She simply inclined her head. He pressed his ear to the door. Silence. Not the silence of emptiness, Miss Marple thought, but the tense, compressed sort of silence made by a person holding their breath. The inspector signaled the constable, who grasped the handle and gave it a sharp twist. The door opened inward. What greeted them was not dramatic a figure crouched behind furniture, no shadow darting for escape. Instead, the room appeared deceptively tidy. A guest bedroom rarely used, the coverlet smooth, the curtains pulled back evenly. Yet the air was disturbed, stirred as though by recent movement. Miss Marple stepped in behind the inspector, her gaze sweeping gently over the room. The first clue sat barely a foot inside the doorway, a faint smear on the carpet, a blend of dust and moisture, the same trail she had noticed below. Someone had stood here briefly long enough to listen, perhaps to hide. Grayson moved toward the wardrobe and flung it open. Empty. The constable checked beneath the bed. Nothing here, sir. But Miss Marple paused by the writing table. Its surface was immaculate, except for one detail, an ornate little box, slightly askew, its lid not quite settled. She touched it gently. Inside were sewing materials, tidy and untouched, no significance in themselves. Yet the box's displacement suggested a hurried hand. Her gaze drifted to the window. Frost clung to the corners, casting thin silver veins along the panes. But at the very center of the lower glass, a faint oval patch had been cleared, as though someone had pressed their face close to look down at the courtyard. Appearances shattered. Truth peered out. She turned. "Inspector, someone came here not to hide, I believe, but to watch." "Watch what?" Grayson asked, scanning the room. "Those below," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps to see who was speaking or what was being discovered." Before Grayson could respond, hurried footsteps echoed from the stairs. Lily appeared at the threshold, pale and trembling. "Inspector, you must come to the back entrance door, and it's unlatched. It was shut earlier. I'm sure of it." Grayson's brows snapped together. "Show me." He rushed past her, constable in tow. Miss Marple lingered only a heartbeat before following, though she moved at her own steady pace. At the bottom of the stairs, she saw Grayson pause by the rear hallway, where the narrow door leading to the garden stood slightly ajar. A thin blade of cold air slipped into the house, raising gooseflesh along Lily's arms. The inspector tested the latch. "Forced?" "No, opened with a key." Lily's voice wavered. "But no one uses this door, only for deliveries in summer." Peter, who had trailed behind Lily, spoke hesitantly. "Sir, if someone used a key, then maybe that missing one Grayson cut him off. Possibly. But to what end?" Miss Marple's gaze rested on the floor. Tiny specks of frost had been tracked in a pattern distinct from the heavier prints of boots. These were smaller, lighter, as though the wearer stepped carefully, deliberately avoiding noise. A thought flickered through her mind. Someone not fleeing the house, but circling it. Watching. Waiting. Mrs. Dowsett appeared from the direction of the kitchen, wringing her hands. "Inspector, all this running about the house, are we any closer to knowing what happened?" Her voice quavered, and Miss Marple heard in it not simply fear, but strain of holding something too tightly for too long. Respectability stretched thin, threatening to tear. Holdrew arrived moments later, his coat hastily buttoned. "I heard the commotion. Has someone escaped?" "No one's escaping," Grayson said sharply. "Someone may be moving through the house, perhaps using back passages." Miss Marple turned her attention to Lily. "My dear, you said the door was latched earlier. When did you last pass here?" Lily swallowed. "Just after speaking to Mrs. Dowsett. She was carrying linens to the laundry." The housekeeper stiffened. "Are you implying something?" Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "Not at all, only noting the timing." But Lily's eyes lingered on Mrs. Dowsett in a way that suggested something more, something quietly realized, or quietly feared. Then, somewhere beyond the kitchen door, a soft thud sounded. Not loud, not forceful, but unmistakably human. Inspector Grayson's hand went to his coat. That came from the service corridor. Miss Marple felt the faint lift of certainty, the subtle shift when a pattern reveals its next piece. Someone was no longer watching from the shadows. Someone was moving towards something, perhaps toward a final mistake. Inspector Grayson moved swiftly toward the service corridor, his footsteps echoing with sharper urgency than before. The constable followed, hand on his baton. Miss Marple came after them at her own unhurried pace, allowing the others to react, while she absorbed the subtler cues, Lily's pale dread, Peter's furtive glances, Mrs. Dowsett's rigid posture, and Mr. Holdrew's narrowing eyes as if recalculating every detail. The service corridor, narrow and dim, carried the faint smell of starch and old soap. A single door at the far end stood half open, its hinges gently rocking as if someone had passed through only moments earlier. The inspector approached it with measured caution, then pushed it fully open. The room beyond was the laundry store shelves of folded linens, a small iron stove for winter pressing, and a narrow window overlooking the back courtyard. It appeared empty at first glance, but Miss Marple noticed something the inspector did not see. A faint indentation in the dust just to the right of the door, as though someone had briefly pressed against the wall to steady themselves. Grayson scanned the room. No one here. But Miss Marple's gaze settled on a detail near the stove. A solitary glove, pale leather, lying slightly crushed as though hastily dropped. It was not Andrew's glove. She remembered the darker, worn pair beside his body, but something more elegant, more deliberately chosen. She bent slightly, her fingers hovering above it. Before she could speak, Mrs. Dowsett hurried in behind them, her breath uneven. "Inspector, truly this is absurd. A glove means nothing. Staff drop things all the time." Miss Marple turned her head gently. "Do they? A house as well managed as this one?" "I should think not." Her eyes rested on the housekeepers. Mrs. Dowsett looked away too quickly. Grayson retrieved the glove with a handkerchief. "Who does this belong to?" The room fell silent. After a long, taut moment, Lily whispered, "It looks like Mrs. Dowsett's from her Sunday pair." The housekeeper stiffened. "It's a household glove." "Anyone could." But Grayson cut her off. "We will determine that shortly." Miss Marple's attention shifted to the window. The frost on the glass bore two small disturbances, thumb-shaped smudges where someone had pressed close to look outside. The pattern resembled the cleared patch she'd seen upstairs, always watching, always observing from behind a thin veil of respectability. The inspector noticed her interest. "Something there. Only that someone has been very careful about where they place themselves," she murmured. "Careful people often fear being seen." A shiver of recognition passed over Lily's face. The girl took one shaky step backward and nearly collided with Peter, who caught her arm. Their shared fear thickened the air. Grayson turned sharply to them. "You two know more than you've said." "I can feel it." Peter swallowed hard. "Inspector, I only kept quiet because I didn't want anyone to be blamed unfairly." "I thought if I waited," Lily interrupted, voice trembling. "We didn't mean to hide anything. It's just that Mr. Andrews was kind to us, and he said to be careful." "Careful about what?" Grayson demanded. Lily hesitated, her eyes filling with a sorrowful confusion. "He'd been asking questions about the staff accounts. He said something wasn't right. He asked me who handled the linen orders, and who signed for certain deliveries. He said someone had been covering their tracks." Mrs. Dowsett's hands flew to her throat. "He questioned you?" "A servant girl." "This is nonsense." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "My dear, questioning those who notice the smallest things is rather sensible." The housekeeper's cheeks flushed. "You're implying I implied nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "But I do observe." Peter looked stricken. Andrews said he'd found a pattern, that someone counted on others being too frightened to speak. Grayson faced the housekeeper. "Mrs. Dowsett, you were nearest the back entrance today. You had the key yesterday. Your glove lies here. Explain yourself." Dowsett's voice cracked. "I only wanted to keep the house from falling into scandal. I thought if there were mistakes in the accounts, I could mend them quietly." "Mistakes," the inspector repeated, coldly. "Or theft?" She flinched. "I never took anything." "Never. But Mr. Lawrence insisted on new suppliers, new invoices, and I trusted him. If there were irregularities, I feared it would be blamed on me. And I've worked too hard." Her voice faltered. The fear beneath it was unmistakable. Respectability strained to breaking. Miss Marple stepped nearer. My dear, sometimes people hide the wrong things, and sometimes they help the wrong people without understanding it. Dowsett's expression wavered, torn between confession and self-preservation. Her mouth opened to speak, but a sudden sound cut through the tension. A soft scrape just outside the laundry window, like a foot shifting on frozen ground. Grayson spun toward it. Someone's out there. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the frost-streaked glass, her breath steady, her thoughts aligning like pieces falling into place. Someone was still watching. Inspector Grayson crossed the laundry and reached the window in 2 swift strides, peering through the frost-blurred pane toward the back courtyard. "Constable," he barked, "check outside." Now. The constable hurried out, boots striking against stone, leaving behind a hush, taut with expectation. Miss Marple remained by the doorway, her gaze lowered a fraction as though listening to the floor rather than the voices around her. A faint vibration traveled through the boards, someone moving lightly along the outer wall, not running, but retreating with deliberate care. Mrs. Dowsett, shaken by the inspector's stern questioning, pressed her back to a shelf of folded sheets. "This is becoming unbearable," she whispered. "Someone skulking about like a phantom." "It is not a phantom," Miss Marple said softly. "Only someone accustomed to being overlooked." Haldrew stepped nearer the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Whoever it is, they're playing a dangerous game." Lily stood frozen in the center of the room, hands clasped to her chest. "Inspector, do you think it's the same person who took the key?" Grayson didn't answer immediately. The constable shouted something from outside, muffled by distance, and a dull thump suggested he'd pursued someone across the garden paths. Then silence. The inspector exhaled sharply. Gone. Whoever was out there slipped off before we reached them. Peter swallowed. There's a small side gate near the potting shed. Hardly anyone remembers it. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. The forgotten places. One learns a great deal by paying attention to them. Grayson shut the window with a decisive snap. No more secrets, Miss Marple. If you have observations, say them plainly. Her eyes warmed, but her tone remained delicate. Plainness is not always helpful at this stage, Inspector, but I might say that people who watch tend to fear being watched in return. His jaw tightened, but he did not press her. Instead, he turned back to Mrs. Dowsett. You were about to explain your involvement in the accounts. The housekeeper's shoulders sagged. I only signed what was placed before me. Mr. Lawrence assured me the changes were necessary. New suppliers, new arrangements. I didn't suspect wrongdoing. But Andrews did, Haldrew interjected, adjusting his glasses. He was beginning to see a pattern. Dowsett wrung her hands. He spoke to me yesterday, asked who had authorized certain expenses. I told him I thought Mr. Lawrence had taken the lead. And how did Mr. Lawrence respond to being questioned? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Dowsett hesitated, eyes darting toward the corridor. He was displeased. He said I'd embarrassed him, that I should leave matters of management to those who understood them. Andrews pressed the matter, Miss Marple murmured. Quiet men often grow resolute when treated dismissively. A faint, conflicted sorrow fluttered across Dowsett's expression. I didn't know he planned to confront anyone today. Grayson motioned them toward the main corridor. Everyone went back to the drawing room. We regroup. He paused briefly. Miss Marple, stay close. As they moved along the passage, Miss Marple fell into step beside Peter and Lily. Their youth made them transparent in ways they could not conceal guilt, fear, loyalty, all flickering across their faces like passing shadows. When the others walked ahead, Miss Marple slowed, speaking softly enough that only they heard. My dears, you both seem burdened, not with guilt, but with something you fear might be misunderstood. Peter's Adam's apple bobbed. Miss Marple, We didn't want anyone to be blamed wrongly. Lily nodded, her voice a whisper. Mr. Andrews said he trusted us. He said we saw things others didn't. What things? Miss Marple asked, her voice almost maternal. Peter hesitated. Small things. Deliveries marked with 2 different signatures, linen orders double-counted. Tools missing from the storage cupboard and returned later without explanation. And once, Lily added, we heard someone unlocking the storage room very late at night. We looked out, but all we saw was a shadow walking away. Miss Marple considered this. Did the shadow resemble anyone you know? They exchanged a nervous glance. It might have been Mrs. Dowsett, Lily whispered, or Mr. Lawrence. They walk in similar ways. People often resemble one another in silhouette, Miss Marple replied, especially when fear exaggerates outlines. They reached the drawing room. Grayson gestured them inside. The room felt different now the earlier restlessness sharpened into something more brittle, as if the house itself were bracing for revelation. As the inspector took stock of the group, Miss Marple's attention drifted toward a narrow glass cabinet along the wall. Its lock showed a faint scratch, barely visible unless one looked closely. She stepped nearer. Inside the cabinet were household records, visitor logs, maintenance notes, expense histories preserved in tidy stacks. A symbolic detail, she thought. Locks protecting appearances, not truth. Haldrew joined her side. Something wrong? He asked quietly. Oh, not wrong, Miss Marple replied. Merely interesting. Someone wished to open this recently. And why would they need access to visitor logs? He murmured. Because, Miss Marple said softly, patterns are rarely isolated. An irregularity in one ledger may echo in another. Before he could respond, Inspector Grayson called from the center of the room. Miss Marple, you've seen something. I can tell. She turned, her expression serene but edged with quiet urgency. Inspector, I believe someone in this house is far more desperate than we realized. Her gaze shifted not slowly, not dramatically, but with a precise, deliberate calm toward one person in the room, and that person stiffened. The stiffness Miss Marple noticed passed quickly, a tightening of the shoulders, a fleeting compression of the mouth, but such small disturbances rarely escaped her. The drawing room held its breath as Inspector Grayson swept his eyes across the assembled faces, trying to identify what she had already seen. Mrs. Dowsett shifted her weight ever so slightly, as though her shoes had suddenly grown uncomfortable. Mr. Lawrence stood rigid, chin raised in aggrieved dignity. Lily clutched her apron with trembling fingers, while Peter hovered protectively near her shoulder. Haldrew, though outwardly composed, watched them all with an auditor's suspicion sharpened by unease. Grayson stepped closer to Miss Marple. Which one, Miss Marple? Who reacted? She shook her head gently. Reactions are curious things, Inspector. One mustn't rush to conclusions. People stiffen for many reasons. Cold, shock, even guilt for something quite innocent. His frustration flickered, but he held it in check. Then what precisely have you observed? That someone has been moving through this house. She replied softly, not to flee, but to watch. And those who watch are often afraid that truth is assembling itself without their guidance. The inspector opened his mouth to question her further, but a sudden knock at the door interrupted. Firm, decisive. The constable stepped inside, breathless from the cold. Sir found tracks outside, light steps, too light for Mr. Lawrence or Dowsett. They lead from the service door around to the side of the house. End near the old coal chute. Grayson frowned. A hiding place? Perhaps, sir, but the chute's locked from the inside. Miss Marple's eyes warmed with quiet interest. A locked space. Another one. The pattern whispered to her concealment, not escaping fear, not cunning. She studied the room again, each facing a possible facade. "Inspector," she said, "before you rush to search, may I propose something?" Grayson hesitated, then nodded. She stepped a little forward, addressing the household with the gentle authority of one accustomed to settling quarrels at village tea parties. "Everything in this house these last 2 days has circled around one thing: knowledge. Knowledge someone feared Mr. Andrews, possessed. Knowledge someone else believed they could conceal behind order and routine. But knowledge," she added with a faint smile, "has a way of slipping through cracks. Even the smallest." Peter swallowed hard. "Miss Marple, you make it sound as if someone here is very frightened," she finished. Mrs. Dowsett's voice rose sharply. "Frightened of what? We've all been terrified since Andrews died." "Before that," Miss Marple said gently. "Long before." The housekeeper's face blanched. She sank into a chair, fingers trembling. Her earlier bravado had thinned to transparency. "I never meant harm," she whispered. "I only wanted the house to run properly." Grayson seized on her words. "Mrs. Dowsett, if you've concealed something," she broke in with a small cry. "No, not concealed, only adjusted. There were shortages in the stores. Linen missing, supplies unaccounted for. At first I thought it was careless tallies. Then I feared it would be blamed on me." Her voice cracked. "I couldn't afford another black mark. Not at my age." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Fear can make honest women bend rules they never meant to bend, but it rarely leads to murder." Dowsett sobbed in relief, though the inspector looked unconvinced. "Then who? Lawrence?" The butler bristled with righteous indignation. "I've served this house faithfully for more than a decade. If mistakes occurred in ordering, I trusted the housekeeper to manage them." "Which," Dowsett snapped, recovering some of her nerve, "you encouraged with your endless new suppliers and complicated arrangements." Haldrew stepped between them. "Enough. This bickering does nothing. Inspector Andrews believed someone was siphoning funds. These two may have enabled the irregularities, but that doesn't prove they intended harm." "But it proves opportunity," Grayson countered. "Either could have feared exposure." Miss Marple moved closer to Lily and Peter, lowering her voice. "My dears, is there anything else Mr. Andrews told you, even something trivial?" Peter hesitated, eyes darting toward Haldrew, then Miss Marple. "He said the person responsible didn't care about money. Not really. It was about pride, or being seen as clever." Lily nodded weakly. "He said someone wanted control, over the house, over everything in it." A murmur swept the room. Grayson frowned. "Control? That suggests a different motive entirely." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Not profit, but power." She moved suddenly toward the glass cabinet she had inspected earlier. "Inspector, would you mind unlocking this?" He obliged, withdrawing the small key from his pocket. As he turned it in the lock, a faint click sounded, the kind of click made by a mechanism recently tampered with. Inside the cabinet, the visitor logs and household rosters lay neatly stacked. Too neatly. Miss Marple carefully lifted the top booklet, exposing a newer sheet tucked beneath a list written in Andrews's precise hand. "Recent access requests," she read softly. "Ledger room, storage cupboards, linen inventories, pantry accounts." She paused. "And here a note. Unusual frequency. Person insists on double verifying all records. Not standard procedure." Grayson leaned over her shoulder. Who was double-checking? Miss Marple slid the paper fully into view. The handwriting was unmistakable, a single initial sign at the bottom. E.H. The room froze. Haldrew stiffened exactly as he had minutes earlier, the same fractional tightening, the same instinctive recoil of a man trapped between calculation and consequence. "Ridiculous," he said sharply. "I was performing an external audit. It's standard to verify records." Miss Marple regarded him with gentle, devastating calm. External auditors do not request midnight access to storage rooms, nor insist on rechecking linen logs, nor watch from upstairs windows to see who is speaking with whom. Holdrew's complexion was drained of color. Grayson stepped forward. "You were outside the laundry window. I was ensuring no one tampered with evidence," Holdrew snapped. "Someone needed to safeguard the books." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Mr. Andrews said the thief did not care about money, only control. Who, Inspector, controls a house more completely than the one who understands every corner of its accounts and sees others as tools to be arranged?" Holdrew's breath caught a single, sharp intake, and that was answer enough. Before the inspector could reach for him, Holdrew turned toward the door with sudden, desperate intent. Miss Marple's eyes followed him with quiet sadness. Someone as clever as he believed himself to always made one final, crucial mistake. And even as he crossed the threshold, she felt the pattern nearing its end. Holdrew's retreat through the drawing-room doorway was swift, almost too swift for a man who prided himself on measured movements. Inspector Grayson surged after him, the constable close behind, but Miss Marple did not rush. She merely lifted her chin slightly, observing with quiet certainty the direction Holdrew chose, not toward the front entrance in panic, but toward the east wing corridor. "A clever man," she murmured, stepping into motion, but not clever in the ways that matter. By the time she reached the corridor, the inspector's voice rang out sharply. "Holdrew, stop where you are." Holdrew did not stop. He cast a frantic glance toward the guest rooms, then veered sharply down the narrower passage leading to the east wing sitting room, the very room where Andrews had died. His footfalls echoed in uneven bursts, betraying the instability beneath his polished facade. Miss Marple followed at her steady pace, her eyes absorbing details Grayson overlooked in his urgency, the slight distortion in a wall sconce brushed by a fleeing shoulder, the swirl of dust disturbed near a side table, the faint scent of cold air drifting from farther down the corridor, as though a recently opened door had not yet settled back into place. By the time she reached the sitting room threshold, Grayson and the constable already had Holdrew cornered. He stood beside the writing desk where Andrew's unfinished letter still lay, the overturned teacup forming a pale stain around its base. Holdrew's expression was one of furious humiliation, a man undone not by guilt alone, but by the collapse of the orderly world he believed himself master of. "You misinterpret everything," Holdrew spat, breath sharp. "I was trying to protect the household to reveal the incompetence that allowed these discrepancies." Grayson glared at him. "You lied about your movements, you stalked the house, you tampered with records, and you were watching from windows as Andrews confronted the truth." Holdrew's nostrils flared. "I acted only to ensure accuracy." Miss Marple stepped closer, folding her hands before her. "Accuracy, Mr. Holdrew, is not maintained by hiding keys, nor by erasing ledger lines, nor by positioning oneself to observe each conversation in secret." His face flushed a deeper red. "I needed time to prove the scale of mismanagement." Andrews would have ruined the investigation with his half-formed conclusions. "Yet he said someone did not care about money," Miss Marple continued gently. "Only about control." Holdrew's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Grayson pressed on. "You were the last person to see Andrews alive, weren't you? He confronted you." "I corrected him," Holdrew snapped. His accusations were clumsy. He misunderstood the discrepancies. "I simply wished to silence him," Grayson demanded. Holdrew recoiled. "No, I left him alive. He locked the door after I left." "To work in private." Miss Marple's voice slipped in like a soft thread stitching a seam. "Mr. Holdrew, the room locked from the inside is true, but the key was turned earlier than the time you claim to have left, and Andrews was writing a note as he died." "Impossible," Holdrew whispered, a dawning horror crossing his features. Miss Marple tilted her head. "You see, he wrote something very specific. He knows about the key." He meant you, Mr. Holdrew. Holdrew staggered back as though struck. No, he couldn't have. He must have meant Lawrence Mr. Andrews was meticulous in his language, she said softly. He would not have written unless he was certain. And you confronted him about the new lock. You demanded access he had denied. Grayson took a step forward. Then when Andrews told you he'd gone to the colonel with his suspicions, he hadn't. Holdrew burst out, the last thread of composure snapping. He was bluffing. He was bluffing to force my hand. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And did it, Mr. Holdrew? Force your hand? The question hung between them like a weight. Holdrew's shoulders sagged. He stared at the overturned teacup, its pale stain spreading into the grain of the wood, as though seeing his own unraveling. It wasn't meant to happen, he whispered. He stood up, and he stumbled. I only meant to take the letter he'd written as part of it. But he grabbed my sleeve, and I pushed him back. Only to free myself. Only that. Lily's small gasp echoed from the corridor behind them. Miss Marple's gaze softened with quiet sorrow. Fear makes fools of the cleverest men, Mr. Holdrew. You wanted everything to appear correct, and when Andrews threatened to expose your tampering, you chose the path that felt most orderly silence. Grayson stepped forward, handcuffs in hand, his expression grim but steady. Edward Holdrew, you are under arrest, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. Inspector, let him have a moment. Holdrew looked at her, incredulous. Why? Why would you offer me kindness? Not kindness, she replied. Only understanding. That is what Andrews lacked the chance to speak honestly with anyone before fear overwhelmed you both. Holdrew's breath shuddered out of him. The struggle drained from his posture, leaving behind a man hollowed by his own pride. Grayson read him his rights. As the constable led Holdrew away, Miss Marple stepped toward the writing desk. Her fingertips brushed the surface lightly, tracing the faint smear of dust where the fallen glove had first rested. A symbolic reminder that the smallest detail, misplaced or scuffed, reveals the truth others work so hard to disguise. Behind her, Lily whispered, Miss Marple, is it over? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the frost-laced window, where a thin line of melted condensation traced downward like a quiet tear. Her voice, when it came, was soft. Nothing ends quite so simply, my dear, especially not the things hidden beneath appearances. The manor seemed to exhale once Holdrew was taken away, as though the old house had grown weary of holding so many secrets in its walls. Inspector Grayson instructed the constable to escort the prisoner to the station, and soon the echo of their footsteps faded down the gravel path outside. The rest of the household lingered in the drawing room, caught between relief and a lingering, uneasy quiet, the kind that follows a storm but leaves the air tasting of unsettled rain. Miss Marple moved to the hearth, adjusting one of the small ornaments that had shifted in the commotion. She had the air of someone restoring balance, not merely to the mantelpiece, but to the atmosphere of the room itself. Lily and Peter hovered nearby, close enough to feel her steadiness, as if her presence anchored the day back to something recognizably safe. Mrs. Dowsett sat rigidly in a straight-backed chair, hands clasped in her lap. The housekeeper looked older than she had an hour earlier, the strain of fear and suspicion etched into the lines around her mouth. I never imagined he would do such a thing, she whispered. He always seemed so calm, so superior. I thought he just wanted the house in better order. Miss Marple settled into a nearby armchair. Appearances can be soothing garments, she said gently, but they hide frayed seams. Mr. Holdrew valued mastery more than honesty. That made him vulnerable to his own pride. Mr. Lawrence stood by the cabinet, stiff with indignation and wounded dignity. I never trusted him, he muttered, always poking where he didn't belong. The remark carried a sting that did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing look. Sometimes mistrust comes from instinct, she said. sometimes from fear. You, Mr. Lawrence, feared the household might be blamed for mistakes not of your making. That fear is understandable but dangerous when it silences truth. The butler flushed and looked away, chastened despite himself. Lily approached Miss Marple timidly. "Ma'am, will the inspector think we're to blame for not speaking sooner? We tried to help Mr. Andrews. Truly we did." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, taking her hand with gentle firmness, "you did help. You noticed things others missed, and you spoke when courage allowed you. That is no small thing." Her eyes softened. "You gave Mr. Andrews his voice when someone sought to take it away." Peter's shoulders loosened at that, the tension in his stance easing. "He trusted us," he said quietly, "and we failed him." "No," Miss Marple answered softly. "The only one who failed him was the man who feared Andrews' knowledge more than his own conscience." Inspector Grayson returned then, brushing frost from his coat. He looked worn, but steadier than before. "The constable has him secured," he said. "A long night ahead for all of us, I'm afraid." He paused, studying Miss Marple with grudging admiration. "I doubt we'd have pieced this together half so quickly without you." She smiled mildly. "It was simply a matter of human nature. Men who wish to control everything often forget the smallest gestures reveal them most clearly." Grayson exhaled. "The key was the turning point, once we understood its importance." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and its symbolism. New keys for new locks are often taken up by those seeking mastery rather than order." He nodded, then frowned as a thought struck him. "One thing still puzzles me. Why linger in the house after the crime? Why watch from windows? Why not flee at once?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Because Mr. Haldrew believed he could still shape the outcome. He believed himself cleverer than the rest of us, clever enough to adjust the narrative, to remove evidence, to anticipate suspicion." Her gaze moved to the frost-speckled window. Control is a dangerous illusion. It blinds a person to the many ways truth slips through cracks. Grayson gave a half-humored sigh. "I suppose you'll tell me that's very common in village life." "Oh yes," she replied. "Perhaps more common than you imagine." Mrs. Dowsett rose on unsteady feet. "Miss Marple, I should apologize. I was sharp with you earlier. I thought you were judging me." "My dear," Miss Marple said warmly, "I was only observing. There is a great difference." Dowsett managed a watery smile, then excused herself to tend to the kitchen, returning to her duties as though order might soothe the house's bruised dignity. The room emptied little by little. Lawrence retreated to the butler's pantry, muttering about restoring correct inventory systems. Peter escorted Lily toward the staff quarters, their steps lightening with each stride. Even the inspector eventually left, leaving Miss Marple alone in the quiet of the drawing room. She rose and crossed to the east wing corridor. The splintered door frame of Andrews's sitting room stood as solemn testimony to the tragedy that had brought them all together. She paused at the threshold, fingertips brushing the carved wood, remembering the gentle clerk with his pale ink and careful ledgers. Inside, the faint smell of cold tea lingered. The key still rested in the lock, a final gesture Andrews had not been permitted to complete. Miss Marple stepped closer. Through the narrow window, early evening light dusted the frost outside with a gentle glow, as if nature were smoothing the day's sharp edges. The room, once locked, once full of secrets, now felt oddly peaceful. She imagined Andrews seated at his desk, scratching out the truth with trembling determination. A quiet man, undone by a louder one. Such things had happened before in village life, and would again. "Poor man," she whispered. "He only wanted things to be right." She lingered only a moment more before turning away. Life in St. Mary Mead would resume its familiar rhythm. The church bell, the morning deliveries, Miss Hartnell's gossip, the vicar's earnest sermons. Outwardly unchanged, Yet beneath the calm, the village would remember this day as a reminder that respectability may hide many threads, and that even a locked room cannot silence the truth forever. As Miss Marple reached the front steps of the manor, a soft breeze stirred the holly branches, carrying with it a faint rustle almost like a sigh. She drew her shawl closer and began the walk back toward the village, her steps steady, her heart touched with quiet melancholy. For mysteries solve themselves with reason, but human hearts solve themselves only with time.